She was 22 years old, and everything she owned fit inside a canvas bag that had belonged to a dead woman. A change of clothes, a tin cup, a beekeeper smoker no bigger than a man's fist, and a woodworking plane with a rosewood handle so worn smooth by years of use that the grain had disappeared entirely into something softer, more personal, like the palm of a hand. And she had $4, not $4 in savings, not $4 set aside. $4 that were all there was in the world that belonged to her, pressed flat in the inner pocket of her coat, and that was the whole of it. No family, no address, no one in the state of Tennessee who knew her name and would have been glad to hear it. But what nobody in the valley below her knew, what she herself did not yet understand, was that those $4 were going to buy her something that had been waiting for her for a very long time, and that inside the walls of the most forgotten building in Harlan County, someone had hidden a truth that would rearrange everything. If you're new here, welcome. Stay with us until the end of this one, because this story earns it. Her name was Verity Holcombe, and she was born in the spring of 1878 in a creek-bottom house outside of Barbourville, Kentucky, the second child of a man named Douglas Holcombe, who worked timber, and a woman named Susanna who canned peaches and kept her grief quiet and died of a fever when Verity was 6 years old. Douglas Holcombe was not a man who knew how to raise a daughter. He knew how to fell a tree, how to judge the line of a ridge, how to work from first light to last and fall asleep before his supper cooled. He was not cruel, but he was distant in the particular way of men who have lost the one person who translated the world for them. And after Susanna died, the house went quiet in a way that no amount of noise could fill. Verity grew up in that quiet. She learned to cook before she was 8, to keep accounts before she was 10, to be useful in ways that did not require being seen. Her brother, Curtis, was 3 years older and left for the mines in Harlan the summer he turned 15 and sent money home twice and then stopped. Verity did not blame him. She understood the leaving. She had imagined it herself often enough, standing at the kitchen window, watching the tree line, and thinking about what was on the other side of it. The person who changed the shape of her life was not her father, and not a schoolteacher, and not any of the men in Barbourville who looked at her in the years after she turned 16 and thought about what she might be useful for. The person who changed everything was a woman named Octavia Marsh, who lived alone on a hillside above the Baptist church, in a house she had built herself from chestnut timber and river stone, and who made her living as a cooper and a woodworker and a repairer of things that other people had given up on. Octavia was 61 when Verity first knocked on her door, carrying a chair with a broken leg and the information, passed along from 3 different neighbors, that Octavia Marsh was the only person in the county who could fix it right. Octavia looked at the chair, looked at Verity, looked at the chair again and said, "Come inside." She fixed the chair in 40 minutes. She charged nothing and said only, "If you want to learn how that was done, come back Thursday and wear clothes you don't mind ruining." Verity came back Thursday. She came back the Thursday after that. She came back every Thursday for 4 years. Octavia Marsh had been married once, briefly, to a man who had not understood what he was marrying and had left when he figured it out. She did not speak of him with bitterness or with sorrow, but with the mild, factual tone of someone describing a road they had once traveled and found unpromising. She had no children. She had her tools, her house, her bees, her woodlot, and her opinion, which she kept mostly to herself, except on the subject of craftsmanship, on which she could speak for hours without repetition. She taught Verity to read wood the way other women taught their daughters to read faces. She taught her that each piece of timber has a character, a direction it wants to travel, a grain that will cooperate or resist, depending on how you come at it. She taught her to sharpen a blade to a shaving edge, to fit a joint so clean that light could not find the seam, to read a floor for level with her eyes before she ever touched a tool to it. She taught her to make doors and windows and staircases, to set a stone foundation, to cut a mortise and fit a tenon and drive a peg that would hold for a century in any weather. She also taught her to keep bees, which she said was not so different from woodworking. Both required patience, she said. Both required you to understand that the thing you were working with had its own nature, and that your job was not to override it but to work alongside it. A good joiner and a good beekeeper were both, at heart, people who had learned to listen. Octavia died in the winter of 1899, in her chair by the fire, with her tools hung on the wall above her workbench and a half-finished blanket chest on the table. She left Verity her woodworking plane, her smoker, her bee veil, and the contents of her small library, which was 7 books on joinery, 2 on natural history, one on medicinal herbs, and a King James Bible with her own notes written in the margins in handwriting, so small you needed a candle to read it. She left nothing else because she had nothing else. The house went to a cousin in Knoxville who arrived 6 weeks later, looked at it, and decided he did not want to live on a hill that far from town. He sold it before spring. Verity kept the plane wrapped in a piece of flannel in her canvas bag. She kept the smoker beside it. These two things together were the entirety of what Octavia Marsh had given her that could be carried. And she understood that they were also the most important things, because they were the proof of what she knew. You cannot take knowledge away from a person, Octavia had told her once, while they were fitting the staves of a barrel in the low afternoon light. You can take their land, you can take their money, you can take every material object they own, but what is in their hands stays there. Remember that. Verity remembered it. Her father remarried in the spring of 1900. The woman's name was Dorothea, and she was 44 years old, with a son of her own named Preston, who was 26, and who had taken a job at the county land office, and wore his authority there like a coat 2 sizes too large. Dorothea was not a bad woman, exactly. She was a woman who had her own history of scarcity and her own ideas about how a household should run. And those ideas did not include a grown stepdaughter who spent her hours in a dead woman's workshop, learning a trade that Dorothea considered unsuitable and unnecessary and faintly alarming. Preston, Dorothea's son, was worse. He had the kind of confidence that comes not from accomplishment, but from never having been seriously contradicted. He did not like Verity's tools. He did not like that she knew things he did not know. He did not like that, when he spoke about subjects he had read about once in a magazine, she sometimes is asked a follow-up question he could not answer. He told Douglas Holcombe on a Sunday afternoon in September, when the air was just turning, that the situation in the house was untenable, that a woman Verity's age ought to be married and settled and not taking up space in a family home while she played at carpentry. He used the word untenable twice. He was very proud of it. Douglas Holcombe was a tired man. He had been tired for years. He sat with his hands on his knees and listened to his stepson, and then he looked at the floor and nodded. And that nod was the most painful thing Verity had ever seen her father do, because she understood what it cost him and what it meant, and that he was doing it anyway. The morning she left was a Wednesday in October. She came downstairs to find her canvas bag on the kitchen table with her clothes inside it, and her tools and the tin cup, and a note in Dorothea's handwriting that said only, "We think it is time you found your own way." Beneath the note was a small envelope. Inside the envelope were $4 bills, and no explanation of why 4 and no signature. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. The stove was warm, the coffee had been made and poured, and 1 cup had already been taken upstairs. The house smelled of biscuits and wood smoke, and the particular morning smell of a family that was not hers. She picked up her bag, put on her coat, and walked out the door. She did not knock on her father's bedroom door to say goodbye. She told herself it was because she did not want to make it harder. But the truth, the honest truth she admitted only to herself on the road outside of town, was that she did not trust herself to see his face and still keep walking. So she kept walking without seeing it, and the cold air hit her, and the road went south, and she followed it because south was where the mountains opened up, and the valleys widened, and she had read in one of Octavia's natural history books that the Cumberland Gap country had the richest soil in the eastern ranges, deep and dark and generous to anyone who knew how to work it. She walked for 2 days. The first night she slept in a cattle barn outside of Cumberland Ford, with her bag as a pillow and her coat pulled tight and the animals breathing slow and warm in the stalls around her. The second night she slept under a limestone overhang above a creek, and the water ran clear over a gravel bed, and she lay on her side and listened to it, and felt the particular hollowness of a person who has been set adrift not by accident but by decision. Someone else's decision made about their life, and she let herself feel it fully, the way Octavia had told her to feel the grain of difficult wood, all the way through, without flinching, because the only way out of a hard thing is through the middle of it. The third morning she came down into a valley town called Redbird Crossing, which was a courthouse, a feed store, a livery, a post office, a church, and 11 houses arranged along a single main road above a river that was still running high from the autumn rains. The town looked like it had been set down carefully by someone who expected to come back and do more, and then never quite had the time. There was a general store run by a man named Harlan Gooch, who was somewhere between 60 and 80 years old, and had the kind of face that suggests a person has seen a great deal and retained only what was useful. He was sweeping his porch, when Verity came up the road with her bag on her shoulder, and he watched her come without expression and said good morning. And she said good morning back and asked if there was any work in the valley for someone who could do woodwork and repairs and keep bees. Harlan Gooch set his broom against the porch rail and looked at her hands, which were calloused and capable and bore the particular marks of someone who works with sharp things and small tolerances. He looked at the canvas bag and the faint outline of the tools inside it, and then he said, "There might be something. Depends on what kind of living situation you're prepared to tolerate." She told him she was prepared to tolerate quite a lot. He nodded and said there was a property about 3 miles out of town, up the East Fork Road past the old mill, that had been sitting empty since before the war, meaning the last war, meaning 1898, and not 1865, though either would have accounted for the condition it was in. It was called the Braddock Place, after the family that had built it. The county had held the title for going on 7 years, and the last assessed value was $4, which was less a statement of market value and more a statement of resignation. The Braddock Place had been, before it was abandoned, a working homestead of about 30 acres, farmland in the creek bottom, a woodlot on the ridge above, a kitchen garden site on the south-facing slope where the soil was dark and loose and had been improved by generations of people who knew what they were doing. The main house was built of hand-hewn chestnut logs, a timber that had been abundant in these mountains before the blight and was already becoming harder to find. 2 stories, central chimney, 4 rooms with a sleeping loft above, and a covered porch along the front and one side that had partially collapsed but showed what it had been. The roof had gone in stages. The east end was entirely open to the sky. The west end, over the main room and the kitchen, was mostly intact, held together by what looked like stubbornness, and the angle at which the prevailing weather came down the ridge. The chestnut logs themselves were sound. Verity walked the perimeter the way Octavia had taught her to walk a structure. Slowly, with her hand on the wood, feeling for soft spots, for the punky give of rot, for the places where water had found its way in and stayed. The logs were tight. The chinking between them had failed in places and would need to be redone. But the logs themselves were solid, the grain close and hard, the kind of timber that takes 100 years to give up. The chimney was double, built of native fieldstone with a firebox on the ground floor and a back-to-back firebox in what had been the main sleeping room above. The stone was dry-laid at the base and mortared above the roofline, and both structures were straight and true, which told her something about the man who had built them. The staircase to the loft was intact. The floorboards on the west side, the sheltered side, were wide chestnut planks that had darkened over the decades but held their nails and did not give underfoot. The kitchen was a separate room, which was common in the older mountain homesteads, connected to the main house by a covered dog trot that had lost its roof but retained its posts and framing. The kitchen fireplace had a crane and a bake oven built into the side wall, and the bake oven door was hand-forged iron that had rusted but was still on its hinges. Someone had cared about this kitchen. Someone had built the bake oven, not because it was easy, but because they wanted to make bread a certain way, and they had intended to make it for a long time. The woodlot was overgrown but full, chestnut and oak and ash and cherry, and a stand of black walnut along the creek bottom that Octavia would have considered an embarrassment of riches. The kitchen garden site was a wilderness of pokeweed and sumac and wild raspberry, but the soil beneath it was exactly what Harlan Gooch had said. Dark and loose and generous and wanting to be worked. She stood in the middle of the main room for a long time, in the cold October light that came through the spaces where the chinking had fallen and through the gaping east end where the roof had gone. And she looked at the walls and the floor and the stone chimney, and she understood something that she had not known how to put into words until that moment. That this house was not ruined, it was waiting. There is a difference between a thing that is broken and a thing that has been abandoned. And this was the second kind. It had been left, not destroyed. The bones were good, the timber was honest, the land still knew what it was for. She went back to Harlan Gooch's store and put $4 on his counter and asked him to write up the transfer. He looked at her for a moment, and what was in his face was not pity and not amusement, but something closer to recognition, as though she reminded him of someone he had known a long time ago and respected. He got out the county deed ledger and wrote her name at the top of a new page. Verity Holcombe, 30 acres, East Fork Road, Harlan County, Kentucky. Consideration, $4. She signed her name. Harlan Gooch blotted the ink and said, "There's a good spring up on the slope behind the woodlot. Runs all year." She said, "Thank you," he said. "You're going to need a hammer." She had tools. She did not have a hammer. She traded 3 days of work, repairing the broken shelving and the counterframe in Gucci's store. Work that took her 2 days, but that she called 3 to be polite. For a claw hammer, a handsaw, a coil of oakum for chinking, and a bucket of lime. She carried these back to the Braddock place in 2 trips and set up her camp in the west room of the house, which was the dry room. The room that the roof still covered and that still held heat from the afternoon sun in its chestnut walls, long after the light was gone. She spent the first week doing what needed doing in order to do everything else. She cleared the debris from the east room, which had a decade's worth of leaf fall and animal nesting, and the remains of the collapsed roof framing, heaped 3 feet deep in places. She stacked what timber was salvageable against the west wall, and burned what was not enough for she built in the yard, feeding it slowly through 2 evenings. She rechunked the walls of the west room. With the oakum and a mixture of lime and creek clay she mixed herself, working section by section from the top down, the way Octavia had shown her. She reset the dog trot posts and framed a new roof over the passage between the house and the kitchen. Using timber she split from a standing dead ash at the edge of the woodlot. On the 9th day, she turned her attention to the chimney. It was not the chimney itself that called her attention, but the hearth. The main firebox in the ground floor room was fronted by a hearth of flat fieldstone, 6 stones in 2 rows, fitted together so closely that she could barely get a fingernail in the joints. She had been burning small fires every evening in this fireplace, and the heat was good, and the draw was excellent. But on the 9th evening she noticed something that had been there all along, and that she had not registered because she had been too tired and too focused on other things. The 3rd stone from the left in the front row was wrong. Not cracked, not sunken. Wrong in the way that a word is wrong when someone has used it correctly, but meant something else by it. The stone was the same flat gray sandstone as the others, the same approximate dimensions, but the color was slightly different, a shade lighter, as though it had seen less smoke than its neighbors. And when she put her hand on it, it had a different feel. Not loose, exactly, but not fixed. There was something beneath it that was not solid. She got the plane from her bag. She did not use it as a plane. She used the edge of the iron, the thin, sharp edge that she kept honed to the same standard Octavia had demanded of her, and she worked it around the perimeter of the stone, feeling for the line between the stone and its mortar. The mortar was old and mostly dry, but there was less of it than there should have been, and it came free more easily than she expected, and she understood as it did that this stone had been lifted before and reset deliberately, by someone who knew what they were doing. She levered the stone up with the plane's toe and set it aside. Below it was not earth and not rubble. Below it was a space, rectangular and deliberate, about the size of a large book, lined on all sides with pieces of flat slate fitted together like the walls of a tiny room. And at the bottom of the space, wrapped in a piece of oilskin that had gone dark with age but had not cracked or torn, was something the size and weight of a small journal. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. The fire was low. The room was dark except for the firelight and a strip of moonlight coming through the rechunked wall, where the oakum hadn't filled all the way to the edge. Outside, the creek was running and the wind was moving through the walnut trees, and everything was very quiet in the way that mountain nights are quiet, which is not silent, but full of sounds that belong there and do not intrude. She picked up the oilskin package and carried it to the window, where the moon came in strongest, and set it on the sill and opened it slowly, the way Octavia had taught her to open a difficult joint, not forcing it, following the line it wanted to take. Inside were 2 things. The first was a small drawstring pouch made of heavy canvas, and when she picked it up, she felt the weight and the specific give of coins inside it. Coins that were not silver but heavier, and she loosened the cord and tilted the mouth of the pouch into her palm, and the coins that came out were gold. Double eagles. She counted them by the firelight. 17 of them. $340 in gold, which was more money than Douglas Holcombe had earned in the last 3 years of his life. More money than the Braddock place had been assessed at since before Verity was born. More money than she had believed could exist in any private space this side of a bank vault. She set the coins on the hearthstone in a row and picked up the second thing. It was a letter, folded twice into a square and sealed with a thick drop of candle wax that had gone yellow at the edges but had held its shape for however long it had been sitting there in the dark below the stone. She broke the seal and unfolded the paper, which was the heavy stock of an account ledger, and carried it to the fire and sat down on the floor and read it. It said this: My name is Josepha Braddock, and I am writing this letter on the 2nd day of March, in the year 1891, in the house my husband Eli and I built in the summer of 1863. When the war was going badly, and we had nothing to go on but the conviction that the world would eventually come back to something sensible, and that a family needed a place to come back to. I am 63 years old. Eli died 2 springs ago, and our daughter Frances was lost to a fever the winter before that, and our son Marcus went to Ohio in 1887 and sends a letter at Christmas and does not come back. I am not writing this to make anyone feel the weight of those losses, because they are mine to carry, and I have carried them, and I am still standing, which I believe counts for something. I am writing this because I am making plans to leave this house, and I do not know who will come here after me, and I want to say something to them before I go. The gold in the pouch is the savings of 28 years. Eli and I put aside whatever we could, a little each season when the corn sold well, and the hogs went to market, and the timber was priced right. We never set out to accumulate anything grand. We only set out to be careful, and to let the careful years add up. It adds up to more than it seems like it should, if you give it enough time. I had kept it to leave to Marcus. I had kept a great many things for Marcus that Marcus does not seem to want. There is no bitterness in that sentence, only the recognition that children become people you did not plan for, and that this is right and probably necessary, and still, sometimes surprising. I am taking what I can carry to my sister in Pineville, and leaving the rest behind. What I cannot take, I am putting in the only safe place I know, which is this house's own bones. A house keeps a secret better than any person ever could. A house has no reason to talk. To whoever lifts this stone, I do not know you. I do not know if you are a man or a woman, young or old, whether you came here by choice or by circumstance, or by some combination of the two that none of us have a word for yet. What I know is that you are here, and that you have done the thing that this house required, which is to pay attention. Eli built this fireplace in the fall of 1863 with his own hands, and the help of 2 neighbors who are also gone now. He set each stone himself. He fitted the hearthstones so closely you could not slide a piece of paper between them. He was that kind of man. A man who believed that the things you built with your hands were a form of language, and that if you built them right, they would keep saying something long after you were gone. I believe he was right about that. Take the gold and use it to repair what the years have broken. Plant the garden, tend the woodlot, keep the creek crossing clear so people can get through in the mud season. The walnut trees along the bottom are worth something to anyone who will wait for them, and I hope you will wait for them. The spring on the upper slope runs clean through July even in a dry year. The soil in the creek bottom will grow anything you ask it to, if you ask it right, which means giving back as much as you take. Be happy here if you can. Eli and I were happy here. Not always, not without difficulty, not without the grief that comes to everyone who stays anywhere long enough, but happy in the deep way, the kind that sits under everything else and holds it up. This is a good piece of land, and a good house, and I am leaving it with the same hope I brought to it, in the summer of 1863, which is that someone will fill it with the sound of living and make it matter again. Josepha Braddock in her own hand, in the house Eli built, on a cold night in March, with the fire burning and the creek running outside, and 30 years of this valley in her bones. Verity read the letter twice through in the firelight, and then she sat very still with it in her lap and looked at the fire for a long time. She did not cry the way people cry in stories, with drama and noise, and the relief of it visible on their faces. She cried the way she had cried when Octavia Marsh died, which was quietly and without performance, with a gratitude too large for the body to hold all at once, leaking out at the edges in the way that the most serious things always do. She did not spend the gold in a rush. She was 22 years old, and she had grown up in a house where money was always almost enough and never quite, and she understood from that experience that the difference between having something and losing it was almost always the speed at which you moved. She let herself sit with it for 2 days before she did anything at all. She worked on the house as she had been working. She rechunked the north wall. She reset a section of dog-trot framing that had gone slightly out of plumb. She boiled water in her tin cup and drank it with a pinch of the dried mint she had found, growing wild along the creek bank. And she thought about Josepha Braddock, who had left this place with her savings hidden in the floor, and her hope hidden in a letter, and who had trusted in the basic decency of whoever came next. On the 3rd morning she walked into Redbird Crossing and went to Harlan Gooch's store and bought 200 feet of roofing lumber, a keg of nails, 50 pounds of cornmeal, 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of dried beans, a pane of window glass, a draw knife for the chestnut splits she would need for new chinking, and a jar of sorghum. She paid with 1 gold coin and received her change in silver, and carried everything back to the Braddock place in 3 trips across the 2 days following, her canvas bag and her arms full each way. She told Harlan Gooch about the house. Not about the gold, not about the letter. About the work that needed doing. He listened with his hands folded on the counter, the way a man listens when he is already deciding to help, but wants to hear the whole of it first. And when she was finished, he said there was a man named Whit Calloway, who had done millwork and general carpentry in the valley for 40 years, and who would come out and look at a roof job if she asked him. She asked him. Whit Calloway came out on a Monday, walked around the house, once without speaking, climbed up to the roof line using the loft ladder she had reinforced 2 days earlier, came back down and said, "You'll need about 300 board feet of riven oak for the east end. I know where the oak is." He was 68, with a white mustache and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood he worked. He said, "I'll need a helper," she said. "You have one." They started the following Monday. Whit Calloway was a man who believed in doing things in a particular order, and did not deviate from the order, regardless of the weather, or the hour, or the encouragement to skip a step. He showed Verity how he wanted the old roofing cleared, which was from the ridge down in horizontal passes, each pass laid out in a clean row before the next one started. He showed her how he fitted each new board tight against its neighbor, with a twist of his wrist that she had not seen before, and that she copied 5 times before it felt natural. He was not talkative. He spoke when something needed to be said and was quiet the rest of the time. And the quiet between them was the comfortable kind. The kind between people who are busy and know what they are doing, and do not require the reassurance of constant speech. They worked on the roof for 10 days. On the 4th day, a woman appeared at the edge of the property, carrying a cast-iron pot and a cloth-covered basket. Her name was Verity Sutton, she said, and she was the wife of the hay farmer half a mile up the road. And Whit Calloway was her second cousin and had mentioned that there was someone fixing the Braddock place, and she thought whoever was doing that fixing might be in need of a hot meal. She set the pot on the kitchen hearth, which Verity had swept out, and pressed into service with a small fire, and said, "There's beans and fatback and cornbread." She did not ask questions. She did not stay. She came back 2 days later with a crock of apple butter and a bundle of dried sage and said, "The sage is for the fireplace, to clean the chimney smell out of the room." Her husband, Leander Sutton, came with her that time, a tall, quiet man with a weathered face, who looked at the dog-trot Verity had reframed and said, "That's good work." Coming from Leander Sutton, Bertie said later, that was an extended speech. A man named Oscar Bray, who ran the grist mill on the East Fork, brought a sack of ground corn and a sack of wheat middlings, and said he had milled for Josepha Braddock's husband for 15 years, and that the first mill run for the new owner was on the account of the old one. A woman named Clary Fugate, who kept a small orchard above the post office road, and who was 67 years old, and precise and small, and apparently afraid of nothing, came by to look at the wild crab apples along Verity's fence line, and said she could graft them to eating stock in the spring if Verity wanted, which would give her fruit in 3 years instead of 8. Verity said she wanted. An old man named Pemberton Farr, who had lived in the valley his entire life, and who said he had hauled timber for Eli Braddock as a young man, came one afternoon with a canning jar of sourwood honey, and said the Braddock place had the best bee tree in the county in that stand of lindens above the woodlot, and that Josepha Braddock had kept hives there for 30 years, and that the honey had been famous. He said this last part with a particular emphasis, as though fame in honey was a serious matter. Verity told him she had 2 hive bodies in her bag in pieces, waiting to be assembled. He looked at her and said, "I'll be damned. And then, my apologies. And then, I'll come back in April and help you site them." The weeks turned. Verity replaced the 4 missing loft treads with planks she cut herself from the salvaged roof timber, fitting them with the care Octavia had taught her, so that they did not squeak and did not shift. She reglazed the east window, the one the years had taken the glass from, setting the new pane in a putty she made from boiled linseed oil and powdered chalk, the way it was done. She replaced the dog-trot roof with hand-riven white oak shingles, splitting the bolts with a froe she traded for by spending 2 days repairing the broken stall boards in Leander Sutton's barn. A job that took her 2 days, because she did it right. She cleared the kitchen garden site of its decade of volunteers, turning the soil with a mattock she bought in town, and she found beneath the pokeweed and the sumac exactly what Josepha Braddock's letter had promised. Dark, loose, river-fed earth that smelled of everything that had ever grown in it and been returned to it. She set up her bee boxes in the linden stand on the upper slope, baiting them with a piece of old comb she found in the hollow of a split oak at the woodlot edge. She tended them wearing Octavia Marsh's smoker and Octavia's veil, which still smelled of wood smoke and the particular sweetness of old beeswax. And she thought, every time she pulled on that veil, about a woman on a hillside in Kentucky who had believed that patience was not a virtue but a skill, and that skills could be taught to anyone willing to come back on Thursdays. She began taking repair work in the valley. Doors that had swollen in their frames, floorboards that had sprung and needed to be reset, a porch railing that had rotted through its post connections, a set of window sashes that needed to be reglazed and refitted in a farmhouse 3 miles up the ridge road. She charged what was fair and what people could manage, and the people of the valley came to know her as someone who did what she said she would do and who did it right, which in a small community is the most valuable reputation a person can have because it is the hardest kind to fake. Word moved the way word moves in a place like Redbird Crossing, which is to say, quietly sideways, through the medium of people who are not sure they are passing it on. Harlan Gooch referred people to her. Whit Calloway mentioned her name at the mill. Bertie Sutton told her sister in the next hollow, who told her neighbor, who sent her husband over to ask about the broken threshold on his smokehouse door. Verity fixed the threshold in an afternoon. The husband stood in the doorway and watched, and said nothing until she was done, and then said she did nice work. She said, "Thank you," he said. "My wife's cousin has a barn that needs re-siding." She said, "Tell them to come by." They came. Others came with them. By January, the house was weathertight. By February, the west rooms were warm enough that she had stopped wearing her coat indoors. By March, the linden trees on the upper slope were putting out their first buds, and Pemberton Farr came by as he had promised to help site the bee boxes, and they spent an afternoon walking the slope together, he talking about the hive years and the good honey years and what the lindens did in a wet spring versus a dry one, and she listening with the particular attention of someone who understands that they are being given something valuable that cannot be bought. On an evening in late April, when the sky above the ridgeline held light until past 8 o'clock, and the creek was running full from the spring rains and the air smelled of new leaves and wet stone, and something sweet she could not yet name, but would later understand was the linden bloom just starting. Verity sat in the main room of the Braddock place on a stool she had made herself from a piece of ash and a remnant of the old dog-trot post. The fire was low. The hearthstone was back in place, all 6 pieces of it. The replaced stone fitted as closely as its neighbors now. The void beneath packed solid with flat slate and creek sand and lime mortar. And she had done it herself, and done it right. On the mantel above the fireplace, she had set 4 things in a row. Josepha Braddock's letter, folded back into its square. The walnut pouch, empty now. The coins dispersed into work and food and tools and the slow remaking of the place they had been hidden to preserve. Octavia Marsh's smoker, small and tarnished and smelling of old char. And the rosewood plane, its handle worn beyond any individual human grip into something more general, more permanent. The record of all the hands that had ever held it and found it honest. These 4 things sat together on the mantel like a sentence. And Verity looked at them and thought about the people they stood for. Josepha Braddock, who had built a life in this valley and buried her savings in the floor not with bitterness but with hope, and who had asked only that, whoever came next, make the place live again. Eli Braddock, who had fitted Hearthstone so closely you could not pass paper between them because he believed the things you built with your hands were a form of speaking, and that you ought to say something worth saying. Octavia Marsh, who had taught her that competence was the one inheritance that could not be contested or diminished or taken away by anyone who did not have the sense to understand what they were looking at. And her father, Douglas Holcombe, who had let her go and whose face she had not let herself see on that October morning, and whom she missed in the particular sustained way of a person who loves someone and cannot stay where that person is. She did not think about Dorothea. She did not think about Preston's, with his 2 sizes too large confidence and his word untenable. There was a limited amount of room in a life, she had come to understand, the way there was a limited amount of room in a well-built house, and you had to be careful what you put where. Outside, the creek ran over its stones. In the linden stand above the woodlot, her 2 hive boxes were quiet and warm. The bees settled for the night, doing whatever bees do in the dark, which Octavia had always said was more than people gave them credit for. Somewhere in the valley, Leander Sutton's cattle moved in their pasture. Somewhere further, a whippoorwill was at it, The same 3 notes in the same patient sequence, not asking for anything, only saying what it had to say. Verity Holcombe looked at the fire, and she looked at the 4 things on the mantel, and she looked at the walls of the room, which she had rechunked herself, and which would stand, she was certain of it, for another 100 years without apology. She thought about a woman she had never met, who had hidden her savings and her hope in the same small space, and trusted that whoever found it would be the right person, and that the right person would know what to do with it. She thought about what it meant to be trusted by a stranger who had no way of knowing you were trustworthy. She thought about what it meant to be worth that trust. She had come here with $4 and a dead woman's tools, and no plan that extended past the next morning. She had spent the $4 on 30 acres of mountain land and a chestnut house that most people in the county had written off as a monument to abandonment. It was the best $4 she had ever spent. It was the best $4 anyone had ever handed her in an envelope, with no signature and no explanation, and no idea what they were setting in motion. The fire settled. The creek ran. The lindens bloomed in the dark above the slope. And for the first time since she was a girl, standing in Octavia Marsh's workshop, watching chips of chestnut fall to the floor in the low afternoon light, Verity felt entirely, specifically, unreservedly at home. We will leave her there, in that room, in that light. But we want to ask you something before we go. Someone put gold under that stone and wrote a letter to a stranger they would never meet, because they believed the right person would come, and they were right. What has someone left behind for you? Something hidden in plain sight, something you almost walked past, that changed where you ended up. Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.